These are the times that try men's souls. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Welcome, I am Thomas Adams. Rights ethics looks at what we ought to do in terms of rights, natural rights, not only those elements we are born with, but those that proceed from our very beginnings and even in terms of our very essence. The two lines that I began with give us the opportunity to view rights from different historical examples. The first, these are the times that try men's souls, are from The Crisis by Thomas Paine. Written in the last days of 1776, when it seemed as if the independence movement, fostered and promoted and being defended by George Washington's Continental Army, was about to be dissolved. Prior to the eventual crossing of the Delaware, there was a crisis that seemed a long way away. In December of 1776, from July of 1776, where you had the Declaration of Independence, where the 13 seemingly interdependent colonies became a new nation. The principles of independence at America's founding are most famously communicated within the second part of the introductory paragraph of Jefferson's mainly penned Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We may recognize these words. They show us rights ethics, and a rights ethics that's based upon the philosophy of John Locke. The part I just told to you is not the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. That begins with the lines, "When in the course of human events," and it's meant to explain why the colonies, in becoming states, are declaring their independence. This section that I was able to recite for you talks about those inalienable, it actually uses the term unalienable, rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which are rights that come not from legislative agreement, but come from, in Jefferson's view, a force beyond, come from the Creator. And why? Because within the founder's view, those rights that could be given by government could also be taken away. So the justification must proceed from a higher entity. And just after the famous lines, we have a reiteration in Jefferson's view of John Locke's principle of the consent of the governed. Divine right was something that John Locke both believed in and reacted against. Living in the 17th century, he really made his mark in the 1680s at the time of the Glorious Revolution, in which you had the imposition of William and Mary as the new reigning, and at that time, Protestant monarchs of England, overthrowing the perceived Anglican, if not papal, ambitions. I should say papally aligned or Catholic aligned ambitions of James II, who was the ousted and would help really bring about what's called the Jacobite proceeding revolutions. John Locke saw within the Glorious Revolution divine right, not from necessarily those in leadership, but those who were the governed. And as opposed to the civil strife that really permeates the thought of the psychological egoism of Thomas Hobbes, a pessimism which does not give the due value to the rights of the governed, at least in Locke's view. Locke sees civil society needing leadership, but proceeding from the rights of the governed, giving their consent to those who govern them. And if those that are in government are not living up to that consensual agreement, there is a perceived right to revolt, or even, taken more institutionally, a right to revolution. And that is what comes across in Jefferson's view of the natural rights that are found imbued within the founding era. He even uses the phrase, the consent of the governed. So there are rights that not only the colonists felt they had, but by extension, proceeding from the thought of Locke, these are rights that all individuals have. The American history event and the founding of the American Republic is something which even Ayn Rand felt was the first existence of a truly moral community premised upon rights itself. So when in the course of human events allows for the beginning of Jefferson's view of rights, those dignities, that value that we have, and as rights, citizenship values, membership values that we have as members of a community are not only an American phenomenon, but one that helps in the further development of a rights ethics philosophy. The second opening statement that I began with, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, proceeds from another crisis. This is not a crisis on the banks of the Delaware, looking at a floundering independence movement, but a crisis that seems to entail the American system itself, not in the 18th century, but in the 20th century. Not during the American Revolution, but during the Great Depression. And those inaugural words in the presidency of, at the time, newly elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt gives us a further characterization of how rights can be seen. The difference between liberty and welfare rights. Liberty rights are seen in the negation of external force. How free are we in terms of our surroundings? What are the external circumstances that we find? Is it cluttered with governmental intervention, or are we given an open space, defined yet open, to pursue our aims? Liberty rights can be seen as negative in that they negate government, undo government intervention. And those would be the rights that would permeate the founding documents, not only the Declaration, but also the analysis provided by the Constitution. A coin has two sides, and if one side of the rights coin would be liberty rights, the other side would be what are called welfare or positive rights. Now, we must not preconceive undue consideration, positive as good, negative as bad, but see them in their functionality. Liberty rights are negative because they negate that which is undue. Welfare rights are positive because they posit or they seek to promote or give certain rights, the giving of rights. And this is very different, very revolutionary, a different view, a different perspective than liberty rights. And those are the rights that FDR, a rather unconventional, creative, and imaginary, progressive politician, statesman, and president, are putting forth in his inaugural address. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. People were afraid that they were not going to be able to make ends meet, not because of external force, not because of an invasion of a foreign entity, but in the day-to-day circumstances. Does government have the duty to provide for certain rights in terms of the people's welfare? And if so, what level of government ought to do that? That has been the perennial discussion in terms of welfare rights. Not the political term, but really the ethical, the philosophical entity provided by government. Are we afraid that government will not provide that? Are we afraid that we are limited in our liberty to be able to provide that? Rights and liberty and welfare all entail freedom. Liberty rights would be freedom from coercion, freedom from external pressure. Welfare rights would be freedoms provided by the government to allow one to exercise their proper consideration in attaining their pursuit of happiness. While it may seem quite complicated, one aspect of rights that we can see, in that it applies to our very human nature properly understood, is that it not only has a wide geographic reach in terms of being global in an undeniable human dignity as found in the great expanse of our world, but also can apply across the centuries. And it can connect the crisis as perceived by those fostering the American Revolution through perils, as well as the crisis perceived by those fostering a response to the Great Depression of the 1930s and to our own day. Rights, liberty, welfare, and freedom are natural yet inalienable dignities that those in leadership have a duty to follow, and those who are being led have the consent to give. And with right, it allows for the ethical distinction between right and wrong to span the negotiated, the substantial, and proceed to the enduring. Thank you.